All right, we are just about to begin. Welcome to Black Swan Revelations. My name is Shane, and today I'm going to be reviewing this book, Stakeholder Capitalism. And this is part one. This book is actually divided into three parts. Let's just go to the table of contents here. Part one, the world I grew up in. Part two, drivers of progress and problems. And part three, stakeholder capitalism. So he dives into the concept of companies and the communities. In this video, I'm going to focus on part one, first 75 years of growth and development, the Kuznets curse, the rise of Asia and divided societies. I'm going to try and do this as quick as possible. I want to make it thorough, but I also want to let you explore this book as well. I want to give you enough golden nuggets, if you will, that maybe you'll be interested in buying this book. I think it's always good to have a perspective to see what other people are thinking, what other people are doing in this world, whether they be people like this guy, to see whether or not he's up to no good, all that kind of good stuff. All right, so let's just go right into. I read a little bit of the preface before in my other videos, so I'm just going to touch on this briefly. Just basically in early February 2020, he already had the concept for a book that he wanted to write, but he had to put on the brakes for it because COVID-19 was happening. So he changed a little bit of his thoughts around that, realizing that this is quickly becoming a global pandemic, if you will. When he found out from one of his colleagues in Beijing that when people were returning from the New Year's Eve celebration, the lunar New Year's celebration, as they returned, they carried the novel coronavirus with them, causing an outbreak and subsequent lockdown in the capital. But this is, I want to focus on this here real quick here. This is kind of interesting here. In this book, I will argue that we can't continue with an economic system driven by selfish values such as short-term profit maximization, meaning the shareholder capitalism, if you will, and the avoidance of tax and regulations. What's interesting about this is, or the externalizing of environmental harm. So when he mentions this right away, the book of Daniel comes to mind, where Daniel 11:20 says, "Then shall stand up in his state a raiser of taxes in the glory of the kingdom, but within a few days he shall be destroyed, neither in anger nor in battle." So I wrote that down because it's kind of interesting that Klaus Schwab touches on the subject of eventually he wants the whole world to be taxed because everyone will benefit on this one world tax system. It doesn't dive into it deep in his book, but he hints at it that if everybody can get on the same page, all the stakeholders, including communities, employees, shareholders, business owners, all this kind of governments, if everybody can get on the same page and there's one universal tax, then we can deploy resources as quickly as possible, mobilize resources from one country to the next. So it's interesting that he says that, and Daniel talks about the Antichrist coming in, the false prophet, and all this kind of stuff. And that's going to be kind of a sign that the world is on its last legs, if you will. And Daniel talks about whoever this is that brings in this one world taxation will be destroyed, but it's not going to be in anger or in battle. Most likely have a heart attack, which is kind of interesting because when you look at Klaus Schwab, he's getting up there in age. And I think the stress and whatever he's worrying about, all of a sudden, he could implement something like this if his organization becomes powerful enough. And then a few days later, he's gone. That's my humble opinion. That's kind of what I see going on here. Isn't this interesting? Aren't you so happy you're on this channel to get my input? All right, so throughout this book, he's tried to be fair and even-handed, whether in presenting the global problems we are facing, their possible causes and consequences and solutions I see to create a better world going forward. But I should immediately add that the views I present here are my own, inevitably colored by my personal life experiences, aka after World War II. By working together to build an economic system on an inclusivity and sustainability and equality, this will come up over and over again, while it inevitably includes death and ruined lives and livelihoods. What? Hang on here. Let's just dive into this paragraph here a little bit. I'm just going to read this paragraph again. I hope this book inspires you, whoever you are, to help build such a system. By working together to build an economic system built on the high inclusivity, sustainability, and equality, we can change COVID-19's legacy. While it is inevitably includes death and ruined lives and livelihoods, it can perhaps orient ourselves toward a more resilient world in that way. I hope the post-pandemic world could be to our generations what the post-World War II era was to my parents' generations. So somebody is going to die and ruined lives and livelihoods are going to happen. He's talking about after COVID. He's not talking about before. It's interesting that he just throws that across the table. Guys, it's inevitable. People's lives are going to be ruined, but this is for the benefit of the stakeholders. If you don't know what a stakeholder is, basically they could be part of the community, they could be part of the shareholders, they could be part of the business, they could be business owners, if you will, employees, all that kind of stuff, the community, the government, all that stuff. That could be anyone that has an invested interest in making the planet a better place. Basically, those are stakeholders. You, me, everyone else. That's his definition. Shareholder is just someone that actually extracts money from the company in the form of dividends, whether that's quarterly, annually, whatever. And the basically they don't care about anything else. They just care about taking their money out of the company. And then at the end, if a company is becoming liquid, the shareholders get first dibs on it. So that's the shareholder. Stakeholder is a little bit more complicated, if you will, more encompassing. And that's what he's trying to get across here. Don't be selfish. Don't just make profit, even though if a company doesn't make a profit, they're not going to be around for very long. So the first chapter, he talks about the 75 years of growth and development, basically what led him to where he is today. Obviously, World War II had a huge influence on him. He saw many factories razed to the ground, which is an interesting term because the first time I heard something being razed to the ground was when you read in the Bible in the Old Testament when Jerusalem was being destroyed by the Babylonians and all their walls were razed to the ground, basically destroyed. It talks about basically how because of the end of World War II, how the Allies basically became wealthy. It talks about whether that's sustainable or not. After you have a crisis, that countries make wealth out of that. Talks a little bit about that in this. He touches a little bit about the idea that we all need to get on the same page. Out of this was created the 1973 Manifesto. And again, the purpose of the professional management, if you will, is to serve clients, shareholders, workers, and employees, as well as societies, and to harmonize different interests of the stakeholders. So all the stakeholders have to have the same interest. Talks a little bit about China. Throughout the book, he talks about China. Doesn't slam China, but he talks about their hockey stick type growth. He shares stories of how it happened. And he talks about where it actually began to shift is when China was allowed to actually, when China allowed companies to come in and actually set up manufacturing plants in China in certain regions, if you will. And before you knew it, there was like over 20 plants opening up because China wanted to be the largest exporter in the world. Talks about that. Talks a little bit about Kuznets' curse, which is basically the idea that if you focus on GDP, you're doing it all wrong because GDP doesn't tell you the whole story. It doesn't tell you the story that Just because a country's producing a lot of products domestically, that doesn't mean that people are actually better off. So he touches on that just a little bit. He says a better way to do it would be to be able to use other markers as well, not just the GDP, even though throughout the whole book he uses GDP as a benchmark so we can understand how companies rise and fall, if you will, how countries rise and fall. Talks about China again a lot on it. Talks about, let's see here, a little bit about, what's this here? The West slows down while China's markets are merging up. So basically China was behind, so now they're catching up really at the end of the day. But what's going to happen, he doesn't really talk about it too much, but what happens when China finally catches up? Now what? Now what do they do? Because right now they're the cheapest game in town, where you can actually manufacture goods in China for cheap, and then they can sell them anywhere in the world. But what eventually happens is, and is happening, is China actually outsources now some of its manufacturing to other places like Vietnam, because they're cheaper than China. So if their labor is cheaper than China, how, and China is cheaper than us, like how, eventually that's not sustainable to just keep going to a country that will provide jobs for their people at the lowest possible price, the lowest possible wages. That doesn't sound sustainable. He talks just briefly on it, talks about the idea that right now there's kind of a couple of options because the debt is rising all over the world. All the countries are basically in debt. Says there's only really a couple of ways that you can solve this problem. One is through more deficit spending. He doesn't encourage that, but he says that's one way to do it, where you can throw money towards infrastructure, towards education, all this kind of stuff. And then another way would be to just default on everything. He says that's not an option either. So basically, he just touches on it a little bit. You'll get that throughout this entire book. And he does touch on the idea that China's in trouble because they are basically, China and India have like 15 of the most polluted cities on the planet. And they make up over half, probably 3/4 of the world's pollution in those 15 cities alone. He talks about that here. And he says that even though China's growing, they're still needing resources like oil and natural gas and all this stuff, and that's not sustainable. They have to import all this stuff they have to import oil from Russia and other countries. They have to import diamonds. They have to import red cobalt to make their electric cars, all this kind of stuff. And what's happening now is they're actually investing in the continent of Africa, specifically countries like Congo, because that's where 90% of red cobalt for electric cars is out of Congo. And they have a huge stake in Congo. They have a huge stake in other surrounding countries in Africa, which is kind of interesting because that seems like that's the trend, where China's going to get more of a foothold in Africa because they need it. They need Africa's natural resources because they just don't have all the natural resources. So that's kind of scary. And their population is aging as well. So they have to deal with all that kind of stuff. So we'll make this into a part 2, but this is basically part 1. So part 2, we're going to talk about the rise of Asia, how that all happened and what that looks like. It talks a little bit about, and I've seen this on documentaries about China, where basically they'll basically bulldoze a mountain in order to bring in skyscrapers and all this kind of stuff. And he says like they're still facing natural disasters, and even though they've gotten wealthy, they don't know how to curb all these natural disasters. And I think part of it is when you start rerouting rivers and canals and bulldozing mountains and stuff, you're going to affect your environment around you. I'm not a scientist, but it just looks like it. So I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into the rise of Asia in the next video, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of a snapshot of the first couple of chapters of what's going on, where his head is, and all this kind of stuff when it comes to this book. And we'll dive in. We'll spend a little bit more time on the rise of Asia and how that affects us today as well. So if you like this kind of thing, feel free to leave a comment. Let me know you got something out of this as well. If you want me to dive a little bit deeper into something based on his book, if you've read this book, let me know that as well. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you in another video. Bye for now.